Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Slightly skewed timetable today, given my attempt to squeeze as many extra minutes out of Speak to Sadiq as I reasonably can. 10 this week. He'll be back next month, and I'd like you to recognise what Andrew did there. When I say we will come back to an issue, when I say that if the Mayor makes a promise in the studio, I've got a memory like Swiss cheese, as regular listeners will know, but there's a crack team of one working on this programme behind the scenes, and we will bring back not just the reminder, but also the evidence, the tape of previous pledges, and I suspect we'll return to that one as well. But I thought, my apologies to everyone who couldn't get on, it was my fault this week, but I felt that we needed some fairly robust and lengthy questioning with regard to street crime. I'm not sure the answers were entirely satisfactory, but I do want now to move on to something that popped up during the course of those conversations, and it is a very strange state of affairs, isn't it, when reform of the House of Lords was put before the House of Commons not that long ago, and I suppose unsurprisingly, but almost everyone that you could describe as a prominent Brexiter was adamant that any reform of the House of Lords would be pretty close to treachery. Here's the weirdest thing, actually. The Daily Mail did indeed use the word treachery to describe Nick Clegg for having the audacity to bring a bill to the House of Commons which sought to reform the House of Lords. Oddly today, the Daily Mail's decided to call the House of Lords a bunch of traitors, effectively, for doing exactly the things that the Daily Mail wanted them to do when they called Nick Clegg a traitor for suggesting that they shouldn't be allowed to do them. Are you still with me at the back? It's the best illustration yet that principles don't really exist in Brexit Britain. Something that you insisted was really, really important and that you passionately believed in 5 years ago could quite easily have been turned upside down by Brexit, because, as we're seeing with the House of Lords, you could have sworn blind that you cared passionately about retaining the House of Lords as it currently is 5 years ago, while today you could be screaming from the rooftops that it needs to be dismantled, changed. I mean, you think I'm exaggerating? This is literally 2012, the Daily Mail's comment editorial. As crunch day dawns for the coalition over Lords reform, dozens of Tories have signalled they will join Labour tonight in voting against a move to rush Nick Clegg's half-baked proposals into law. The Mail hopes more will join them. Of course, this paper understands that coalition politics, yada, yada, yada. Leave aside that in the depths of this rapidly worsening economic crisis, Lords reform is an utterly irrelevant distraction from the urgent business of government. And this is my favourite bit. The way we are governed, nodding them through in a shabby tit-for-tat deal, can only be a gross betrayal of Britain. So House of Lords reform in 2012 would have been a gross betrayal of Britain, according to the Daily Mail's editorial line. Today's front page, it's time to pull plug on the Lords. I know sometimes even I begin to wonder whether I'm exaggerating the sheer hypocrisy and fraudulence of the ruling class and the puppet masters in the media, but these are astonishing. Do you want a list of Tory MPs who voted against reforming the House of Lords in 2012? Okay, and then what I want you to do, if you're listening at home, is shout pro or anti with regard to Brexit. Or shout Brexiter or sane. Pick your own description, or I'll give you the name and then you shout at your radio Brexiter or Remainer. Okay? Jacob Rees-Mogg. Yeah, he voted against reforming the House of Lords in 2012. You still with me? Yeah. David Davis. Yeah, okay, that's 2. Steve Baker. Okay. Philip Davis. Yep, 4 for 4. Nadine Dorries. Yep. John Redwood. Okay, this is getting a bit repetitive. Bernard Jenkin. Yep, adamantly opposed to reform of the House of Lords in 2012. Bill Cash. Sir Bill Cash now. I don't think he was in 2012. It's important to give him his proper title. Penny Mordaunt. John Whittingdale, Edward Lee, Philip Hollowbone, Andrew Bridgen, Anne Main, Zach Goldsmith, David Amos, Adam Afriri, John Barron, Bob Blackman, Connor Burns, Christopher Chope, Geoffrey Clifton Brown. Geoffrey Clifton Brown. Everybody. Richard Drax, James Gray, Adam Holloway, Julian Lewis, Andrew Rosindell, Nadeem Zahawi. Every single one of them. Today's front page of the Daily Mail, it's time to pull plug on the Lords. 6 years ago, anybody suggesting reform to the House of Lords was a treacherous ne'er-do-well, indulging in, and I quote completely, a gross betrayal of Britain. How remarkable. And, of course, the reason why we need an important House of Lords is, in the words of the Daily Mail, to keep checks and balances on an executive that has too much power. In other words, a government that could ride roughshod over parliamentary sovereignty and push through proposals and conclusions that precisely nobody voted for, specifically. So what I'd like to do now, and I will need your help, is not to talk necessarily about Brexit. We all have to acknowledge that Brexit has become a distorting lens, which makes, sadly, it makes a mockery of almost everybody now on the Leave side, because I don't think anybody could prove that they voted for what is now happening. But that is the nature of binary referendums. What the House of Lords story proves is that actually there is no such thing as principle in public life for a lot of these people, because they would have gone to the bridge to defend the House of Lords 6 years ago, whereas today, because the House of Lords has done exactly the thing that it's there to do, put the brakes upon an unduly powerful executive, or at least an executive seeking to ignore Parliament in many ways, and the House of Lords are saying, you can't ignore Parliament. It's doing precisely the thing that supporters of the House of Lords have always said we need it there to do. But supporters of Brexit are furious because it's doing precisely the thing that supporters of the House of Lords have always said it was supposed to do.
First today, the House of Lords defeated the government again over Brexit last night with an amendment which would give MPs the power to stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal or make Theresa May return to the negotiating table in Brussels. Well, another parliamentary setback for the government's Brexit policy. Another angry Daily Mail front page. The Mail says the House of Lords is showing itself to be a house of unelected wreckers and that the vote shows the Remainer elite in cahoots with Brussels is fighting a guerrilla war against Brexit using any weapon it can. Well, there was some highly charged language on all sides during the debate. Let's take a look.
We remember the reluctance of Mrs May to allow Parliament itself to be involved. She wanted the government to be in charge. And my mind went back to Berlin in 1933, March 1933, when the enabling bill was passed in the Reichstag. And that enabling bill transferred the democratic right from the Parliament into the hands of one man, that was the Chancellor. And his name was Adolf Hitler.
This House is, of course, a cosy cabal of Remain. It is a wrecking amendment in substance. And those proposing and supporting it are playing the role of a fifth column for Monsieur Barnier and the EU negotiators. They are doing, I'm sure he's very grateful, they are doing his job for him.
Well, with me is the Shadow Deputy Leader of the House of Lords and Shadow Brexit Minister Baroness Hayter. The vote, according to the Daily Mail last night, to have this reconsideration, the House of Unelected Wreckers.
It's funny, isn't it? The whole point of the House of Lords, of course, is that it is unelected, that we're not there all the time, have to look over our shoulder. Are we going to be promoted? Are we going to be deselected? Is there something at the moment that we want to get out of the Prime Minister? We are a group of people, ex-judges, well, some bishops, ex-ministers, industrialists, all sorts of people put there to offer a life's experience to what's going on, the big questions at the moment. That's our job.
And
that's
was
what we
the
did.
purpose of that vote last night by a heavy majority to actually stop Brexit happening?
Absolutely not. What it was about, and your colleague Lewis has just been saying, the Cabinet at the moment is deeply divided over the sort of Brexit deal it wants. We're going to come out, and it is a matter now of what sort of deal. And there are pressures on it, as we've heard from one side, from the arch-Brexiteers, and we're basically saying, as Mrs May promised, there would be a vote in Parliament, and we're saying that negotiations, when you've finished in Brussels, must come back to to the representatives of the people, to Parliament, to see if the deal is good enough.
But some of the people who supported that vote last night do think this could be a way of stopping Brexit, don't they? They've been quite open about it. That rethinking, they think people will say it's a stupid idea and then it won't happen.
Yeah, there are some people. Those people, on the whole, were even more keen on the vote that got defeated, which was to have another referendum. So the people who really wanted that, on the whole, were supporting something else. This was much more wide. It's interesting if you look at all the ex-cabinet secretaries, all the ex-senior civil servants, a lot of lawyers, much more constitutionalists were voting for the one that won and saying, no, this is for Parliament, not for a minority government, but for Parliament to decide, is the deal you've got good enough? And that is really quite just a constitutional requirement.
But if one side can't deliver, which effectively what this vote would put the government into the position of being, that weakens its negotiating position, doesn't it?
I don't think it does. It's interesting that once Barnier, on behalf of the EU27, finishes the deal, he has to take it to his equivalent parliament, to the European Parliament, and he has to get the deal through there.
Yeah, but they're not voting to possibly change the deal or renegotiate. They'll either accept the deal or they won't.
Well, they could put a rider on it, so they could say, actually not good enough for our citizens or something like that. So they could try and affect it. But the interesting thing is, the fact that they have a deal will influence what Barnier thinks he can accept. And I think that is the strength of what we did last night. By saying that the Prime Minister has to bring back to Parliament what she negotiates, it will influence what she's prepared to accept.
Now, when you say Parliament, couldn't the Lords then just block this all again when that meaningful vote happens?
We very carefully made sure that wasn't what was going to happen. In fact, interestingly, right at the very beginning, what Mrs May said would be there'd be a vote in both houses. And I was very surprised at that. I don't believe the Lord should have a veto. And so I've always been involved, very keen that we put this into a law in a way that does not give the Lords a veto over the Commons. So the way we crafted that, and it was very carefully crafted that we did last night, if the deal wasn't acceptable, it goes back to the Commons, and it's very specific in the amendment. It goes back to the Commons, to the elected House, to decide the next step.
Now, we're also joined by Baroness Ros Altman, who she's in North London. She was one of the Conservative rebels last night. There she is. Ros Altman, do you feel like a traitor today? I mean, you were made a Baroness by the Conservative Party. Shouldn't you follow the Conservative Party line?
I am deeply saddened to have the suggestion that somehow I'm a traitor, and I would absolutely refute that. I think those colleagues on the Conservative benches who voted for this amendment are doing what we were expected to do by our Constitution, which is to ask the elected House to think again. We're not making the decision. We don't have the power to stop Brexit or overturn the will of the people. We are simply there to say to MPs, we've looked at this legislation and we think you might need to reconsider something. It's what we did on tax credits, and that was legislation that came to us from the Commons, which had been passed through the Commons, and the House of Lords looked at it and said, actually, we think you need to think again, and MPs did think again, and made a different decision. That's up to the MPs. But what I feel is so worrying is that the hard Brexiters are trying to paint people who are simply attempting to protect the national interest and do what they think is the right thing to do as some kind of traitor vilifying us for doing our job.
But you would like to stop Brexit, wouldn't you? I mean, you don't want Brexit to happen. You think it's a bad idea.
This is not about stopping Brexit. And actually, all it was saying was Parliament must be in control of whether we leave the EU and on what terms, rather than Parliament being offered a meaningless choice between a terrible deal or no deal at all, which is even more terrible. And there seemed to be overtones in the House of Lords debate yesterday from extreme Brexiters who'd want to try and railroad hard Brexit or no deal, they don't mind which, through the House of Commons without giving MPs an actual vote on whether the terms of the deal that Mrs May decides and her ministers decide they want to present is actually okay for the country. You know, this is the most monumental decision most of us will ever be involved in our lifetimes. And to suggest that a group of ministers should be able to override Parliament and offer a meaningless vote, which is take a terrible deal or don't have a deal at all, which is even more catastrophic, is not what Parliament's there for. And the British people voted to restore our parliamentary sovereignty. This bill, as it came back to us,
you say the British people voted to restore our parliamentary
to override it.
But I mean, Baroness Hayter, isn't this really an attempt by Parliament to get back in on the Act, having decided that the people were going to decide, that they were going to vote for leave, and now politicians are saying, well, actually, we need to decide, you know, the people voted to give us power. They didn't. They voted to leave the European Union.
Yeah, they voted to leave the European Union. That's fine. I understand that.
And they voted, not Parliament.
Yes, and Parliament decided that they should have that decision, and they took that decision. We're now in a completely different issue. We're now trying to find on what terms should we leave. Married couples sometimes divorce. Once they've taken the decision, you then have to sit down and negotiate, I'm afraid, the divorce agreement, and how you're then going to live together and how you're going to look after the kids and all of that. That's the deal we're now discussing, and that is something that Parliament, not a minority government, but Parliament should decide.
I mean, I appreciate you want to be relevant, Ros Altman, but in the end, wasn't the decision passed by the will of Parliament to the people, and now you're trying to go back on it?
The decision of the British people was that we should leave the EU. It didn't determine a direction of travel, and what this bill is all about is respecting the result of the referendum and trying to implement it in the best possible way. That was the will of the people. They are trusting Parliament to negotiate for them a good future outside the EU. They were promised lots of different things by the Leave campaign. Now, if those issues are dealt with by Parliament, that's fine. But we must make sure that it is Parliament that is in control, all the elected representatives are in control, not just one small group of ministers who come back with a deal, who perhaps don't mind crashing out with no deal, and maybe overriding the will of the majority of the Commons, who would have no say unless they have a meaningful vote.
Baroness Hayter, I just wonder where you think all this is heading, because obviously, as you say, it's a minority government. The opposition, both in the Commons and in the Lords, is very important. Where do you think we're going to be in 6 months or 9 months' time?
God, if I knew that, I'd be much richer than I am now. I do find politics very difficult at the moment. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting the government is saying, oh, we can't possibly take this back to Parliament. They're going to have to take it to the DUP and get it through them. So the idea that you don't report back and take soundings is silly. It is very difficult to know. I think that Northern Ireland is a big question that needs solving. My judgment is that we will have a better deal as a result of what we've now agreed. In other words, that it has to go through Parliament than we would have had otherwise. If we manage to move the government that far, we'll have achieved something. But I still find it very hard, I have to say, to predict. Who knows? You and I think 20 years ago, were watching the result of a great Labour victory. I think you were there.
Yeah, 21 years ago.
21 years ago on the
today,
indeed. On the
New Dawn
embankment. New Dawn,
broken.
has it broken? Has it not? And who would have predicted where we are now? But I have to say, I find it very hard to know by the end of the year. But what I do know is that Parliament has to be involved in this, and that I think was something I'll be very proud of. Is that vote we decided last night.
OK, thank you both very much indeed for joining us.
So I would quite like to try to have a conversation about the House of Lords, not about Brexit. Because again, these magic words that I'm going to start using with rather more frequency, I don't know anymore. I'm kind of quite liking the House of Lords. I had a chat with Martin Lewis not long ago, the money-saving expert, and I've always thought he should be in the House of Lords. I didn't realise you could apply to be a crossbench peer, and there's some sort of voting process under which crossbench peers, so what you could, I think, loosely describe as truly independent experts, get seats in the House of Lords, and he didn't get picked, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. That does speak of a sort of out-of-touch, fuddy-duddy coterie of ermine-clad dreamers, but that's just because I think Martin Lewis is a force for epic good. What do you reckon now? Because what I don't understand is how you could change your mind about the House of Lords. So it is going to be a bit about Brexit, this conversation. Can you explain to me how you can change your mind about the House of Lords because it's doing the things that you wanted it to do when you liked the House of Lords? No one's going to ring me on that, are they? Because no one's going to admit to being that hypocritical. And you, of course, haven't got a newspaper front page that you can print your hypocrisy on while being entirely unaccountable. So how can we phrase the question in a way that won't scare people away? 0345 6060 973 is the number to ring if you're not scared. What I want is the significant swathe of the population who, right up until this week, thought that the House of Lords was marvellous. They've even gone after the Duke of Wellington today. The Duke of flipping Wellington. Hey, crikey, if you really are into pageantry and tradition and history, then the Duke of Wellington, one would imagine, the heir to the man who led a multi-European army to victory at the Battle of Waterloo, you would imagine that the Duke of Wellington's heir might be slightly off limits for the nostalgic pageantry brigade. No, they've gone after the Duke of Wellington for having the audacity to do exactly what members of the House of Lords are desired to do by people who have historically supported the House of Lords. Are you still with me at the back? So, can you explain to me how you... Again, I'm going to phrase it in a way that sounds critical, but maybe there isn't a way to ask this question nicely. Up until this week, you were a massive fan of the House of Lords because you kind of buy into that slightly rose-tinted, sepia-toned vision of Britain, which looks backwards more than it looks forwards. House of Lords today has done precisely, or this week has done precisely the things that supporters of the House of Lords want it to do. It's scrutinised legislation. It's put the brakes on a slightly rapacious plan from the executive. It's insisted that Parliament, not Prime Minister, will have the final say on deeply, deeply important changes to British law. And yet people who 6 years ago thought the House of Lords was the bee's knees and entirely not in need of reform are very cross about it. This is nuts, actually. The more I talk about it, the more insane it seems. So no one's going to ring me, are they? No, how could anybody possibly ring me up now and say, yes, James, I've always been a massive supporter of the House of Lords until they did something that I didn't like, but which fits entirely with all the things that I've always thought that they should be doing, and now I've turned against them. This is why newspaper editors never, ever, ever put themselves up for interview. Because you can do it on the front page of a newspaper. You can do it unchallenged in a studio, as long as nobody is allowed to question you or is informed enough to point out your hypocrisy. But you can't do it in this context. No one's going to do it. Who is going to put their hands up now and go, yes, I have completely changed my view about the House of Lords in precisely the same way that long list of Conservative MPs that you just read out have probably done as well. And I've done it precisely because they've had the audacity to exercise skill and judgment in pursuit of a conclusion that I don't like. And now you tell me how we're taking back control and how our Parliament is sovereign and how this is somehow evidence of democracy. A vote in the second chamber to put a brake upon a government trying to ride roughshod over the first chamber is both the definition of parliamentary sovereignty and the very emblem of democracy in action. And who's unhappy about it? Precisely the people who've spent the last 2 years bleating about sovereignty, democracy, transparency and accountability. I've given up thinking that this is the flag that we stick in the top of the mountain and now everybody's going to have to salute it. I've given up thinking that a moment would come where the penny assumed such epic proportions that when it dropped the whole world shook. I've given up thinking that the whole crowd is ever going to go, oh crikey, yeah, the Emperor is naked after all. So I don't think even this will make people go, oh, that's odd. I don't quite understand how I've become such a hypocritical idiot. Because I've always really liked the House of Lords. And now they've done what I've always liked them for doing. And now I'm really cross with the House of Lords. Good Lord. It's almost as if Brexit has poisoned the public water supply and robbed half the country of the ability to think straight. Give me a ring if you can. And I don't think you can. And I'm not being the devil's advocate and sort of provoking you into ringing in. Because you can't. No one's going to ring me up and say, I'm a massive hypocrite. They're just going to keep hiding. How can anybody who voted against reform of the House of Lords in 2012 today be signing up to the idea that it's time to pull the plug on the Lords, as the Daily Mail, one of the chief cheerleaders for resisting reform to the House of Lords in 2012, today treats its readers with such undisguised and undiluted contempt that it now, in the space of 6 years, has gone from saying black is black to saying black is white, to saying 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, to saying 4 legs good, 2 legs better. That's what they're doing. And I still, after all these months of examining it, critiquing it, scrutinising it and describing it, I still don't understand how people can be so comfortable and so happy when they're being treated with such ill-disguised contempt. Because you'd have to sit there, wouldn't you? You'd have to sit there and say to yourself, well, we're going to do the polar opposite of what we did 6 years ago. We're now going to try to convince these mugs that buy our paper that we don't like the House of Lords. And you'd have to say to yourself, and this is why I despise the brand of journalism that has infested this country since the moment Rupert Murdoch bought The Sun and put Larry Lamb in charge. Do you know why he got rid of Larry Lamb? It's because Larry Lamb got a knighthood. Murdoch hated having to call him Sir Larry. That's how Kelvin Mackenzie got the gig at The Sun. But from that moment onwards, this country's decline democratically has been led by newspapers. And today we see a form of apotheosis. Right-wing newspapers calling for reform to the House of Lords. And there's no way they could do that unless they sat there in their clubs with their cigars and their shoes that never see pavements, because everything is carpeted and chauffeured, and they know somewhere deep inside, or they believe somewhere deep inside, our readers are so stupid that we could now even start turning them against the House of Lords. No, we can't, boss. Not the House of Lords. You'd be turning them against the monarchy next. Well, wait and see if one of the young royals accidentally lets slip that they think you're leaving the European Union is a stupid idea. And you'll see the right-wing newspaper going after the royal family as well. Because now it's sociopathic. We have now reached a point where facts don't matter. You've picked a team, even if all the evidence is that you're going to get thumped 20-0, you've still got to keep screaming from the sidelines, we're going to win the cup. We're going to win the cup. Which was quite a roundabout way of saying I don't think anyone's going to ring me on this subject. Feel free to prove me wrong. 0345 6060 973. And if you're not prepared to take a moment to examine why you have, in the space of 20 minutes, being persuaded against a House of Lords that you've spent your entire life being in support of, then we'll come at it from the angle I'm coming at it from. Is there another analysis of these particular facts that doesn't lend itself to the conclusion that we've now seen hypocrisy and deceit move into the public discourse on a scale that has never really been seen before? House of Lords, right-wing media, well, they go together like a horse and carriage, don't they? House of Lords, right-wing media, don't be daft, they'll never turn on the House of Lords. House of Lords, right-wing media, good grief, it's the cream in my coffee, it's the icing on my cake. House of Lords, right-wing media, Brexit, oh, down with the House of Lords. Pull the plug on the House of Lords. Down with these ermine-clad traitors. And you listen to this, and everything I'm saying to you is true. And somewhere inside, for, I don't know, about a third to a half of the people listening to this programme right now, somewhere inside you're resisting it. Somewhere inside you're I mean, you can be vile about me, that's fine. But in terms of your own position, somewhere inside right now you're going, no, that's not what's happened at all. I've always been a supporter of the House of Lords, but now I'm not anymore because of Brexit. But James is quite wrong when he says that people have changed their minds after a lifetime of supporting the House of Lords because it's handed down a decision based on precisely the reasons why I've spent my life supporting the House of Lords. Holy moly. The Duke of Wellington and the Lord Archbishop of Leeds today find themselves at the top of the totem pole, being danced around by right-wing newspaper editors, seeking to persuade the public now to turn their furious ignorance on the House of Lords. Give me an explanation that isn't as bleak as that. Thing is, House of Lords does need reforming. It should have people in it who didn't get there simply by dint of birth. And I know the hereditary element now gets elected in large part, but it's daft. Which reminds me of that brilliant line from the Duke of Westminster when he was asked by an ordinary punter for advice on becoming incredibly wealthy. And do you know, the Duke, I've told you this a dozen times, but some stories are so good they merit repetition until the cows come home. The Duke of Westminster said, well, my advice to you, old boy, would be try and have an ancestor who came over with William the Conqueror. You look at, and this is genuine kind of Occupy Wall Street territory, but if you look at the relatively small number of families, I'll tweet it after the show, whose estates and fortunes are still built upon the way the country was carved up after 1066. It is astonishing how many of them are still in positions of prominence. Because the Duke of Westminster's family name has become Grosvenor over the years. It wasn't Grosvenor to start with. I forget precisely what it was, but it was very, very French. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. Here's the Daily Mail in 2003. The truth is, this Prime Minister hates the robustly independent Lords, which has proved a more effective check on an overmighty executive than the Commons. That's incredible. So today, the Daily Mail tells you, because the Daily Mail thinks you're stupid, that it's time to pull plug on the Lords. Why? I'll tell you why. Because whoever wrote that headline hates the robustly independent Lords, which has proved a more effective check on an overmighty executive than the Commons. I mean, literally. This isn't me going off on one. This is literally the case. The reason why the front page of the Daily Mail today says it's time to pull plug on the Lords is precisely because whoever wrote that headline hates the robustly independent Lords, right? Everyone can agree on that, even the most arch Brexiter listening. Whoever has called for the plug to be pulled on the Lords because traitors, on the front page of a national newspaper, traitors, the language of charlatans and dangerous demagogues throughout history has always had traitors at the top of the vocab list. So why is it time to pull plug on the Lords? Well, let's go back to the same newspaper's editorial in 2003. The truth is, this Prime Minister hates the robustly independent Lords. The truth is, this newspaper hates the robustly independent Lords, which has proved a more effective check on an overmighty executive than the Commons. Literally describing an executive that sought to push legislation through the Commons without having a, quote, meaningful vote. Now he wants a Lords full of policemen, puppets and toadies. Well, why would you want a Lords full of policemen, puppets and toadies? Well, so that they do whatever they were told to do by whoever thinks now that we should be pulling the plug on the House of Lords. Go on, riddle me that. Aaron's in Liverpool. Aaron, you better have some jokes, mate, because I'm fit to burst this morning.
Oh, my word, jokes. I don't know about jokes.
All right, what did you ring in to say then?
First thing I want to say before anything else is I want to thank you for holding Sadiq Khan to account. I think that's a really important service you're providing there.
Thank you. So you were actually listening, were you, as opposed to furiously typing away on your keyboard while sitting in your mum's back bedroom on a stolen Tesco laptop in a dirty bathrobe?
There are a lot of assumptions there which are not very nice that I'm not going to address.
Carry on, then.
Okay. I don't think we're going to agree because I happen to be on the Brexit side of things, but I can't answer your question directly the way you posit it, because it seems to be that the Lords hasn't changed tack in your view since 2012, and
well, it hasn't.
In my view, they have, because what they're now doing is they're more testing the limits of their remit compared to how they were before. They were beginning to, but now they're really pushing the boundaries of even the convention of interference of the government of the day's manifesto. So
that's what they always did, mate.
They've always done it to an extent, but now that with 14 challenges to the
so they've always done a good thing, but now they're doing too much of a good thing.
The good thing again is this is a subjective opinion. I think
no, well, it is a subjective opinion, but I'm examining the cheerleader of the right-wing media's opinion on it, which is it is a very, very good thing. And you go back to 2003, and it was such an amazingly good thing that there's an entire editorial about how important it is, and now it's not a good thing. So what's changed?
I've never felt that the Lords is right the way that it is.
Nor have I, oddly.
Well, we'll find that we can agree on something then. It should be a reforming chamber. It should have the power to scrutinise legislation, but it shouldn't be returning and frustrating process.
No. Well, you can use all these words if you want, but that is what a revising chamber does. It's only frustrating if it's done something you didn't want it to do. So what I'm interested in is
I disagree with that, because
okay.
A revising chamber will enhance and improve and suggest rather than saying no.
Yes, but it is.
And that's
exactly what it's done. Now. It's enhanced and improved and suggested.
Okay. Well, as I say, I knew we weren't going to agree on much, but I thought I'd offer an opinion to you that...
And I'm grateful for it, but as I said, it has enhanced and improved and suggested. You just think it hasn't, so you take a negative view of the whole chamber. And it hasn't changed since 2012. In fact, the opposite is probably true. In 2012, we had an opportunity to reform it. But the question I'm trying to get an answer to...
No, I don't mean it's literally changing in terms of its makeup. I mean...
It's just started doing things you don't like.
More enhanced stance.
Yes, which you started doing things you don't like.
Well,
so its powers haven't changed at all.
Beyond the remit.
Aaron, it's not beyond the remit, my friend. This isn't a matter of opinion. It's exactly the same as it was in 2012. So we can have a difference of opinion, but we can't have a difference of fact. Its constitution, its powers...
I agree, but I mean, why is it...
Hang on a minute, I haven't finished speaking. Its constitution, its powers, and its membership is exactly the same as it was in 2012. So you can say I don't like what it's doing, but it hasn't changed. Its powers, its constitution, and its membership is identical. So you, like me, are left trying to work out why somebody who in 2012, and I read you the long list of Brexit-supporting MPs, was absolutely adamant that reform of the House of Lords was anathema, and now they're calling for it. So, like me, you can only speculate from the outside because you're not part of their tribe, and I don't think anyone in that tribe will ring me. So what do you think their psychological process has been?
I'm not entirely sure. Beyond...
Well, nor am I, but I've had a go. It's your turn.
Beyond the possibility that they are trying to frustrate Brexit, and if you listen to Nick Ferrari this morning when he spoke to a member from the House, it could have been interpreted that was their perspective. But I think.
But that's not what I asked. What I asked is how can somebody go from absolute adamance that the House of Lords must not be reformed in the blink of an eye to calling for the plug to be pulled? So what do you think's gone on in the minds of all the people on the same side of the Brexit argument as you?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't think it's a bad thing to change your mind if you generally have.
But why have they changed their mind, do you think?
There's possibly lots of motivation. I can't in the end speak for them.
Why did you ring me?
I rang you to suggest that there was a perspective from the Brexit side which wasn't necessarily the same in 2012 as it was in 2018.
So what's changed?
There has been a change in the way in which they test the barriers of their remit.
But there hasn't. The way they vote is exactly the same. The way they're selected is exactly the same. The way they're constitutionally bound is exactly the same. The way that they scrutinise legislation and send it back to the House of Commons is exactly the same. The way they count the number of members of the House of Lords who vote aye or no is exactly the same. Every single element of the House of Lords is exactly the same. But I appreciate you've rung me up to tell me that it's changed.
It's constructed the same way, but now they're operating slightly differently.
No, they're not, though, are they? How are they voting different? So you think in 6 years ago, they didn't vote according to what they thought?
James, that's not what I'm saying.
How do they vote now, then? Because 6 years ago, they voted according to what they thought after examining the evidence. You're saying that it's changed, so how do they vote now?
Well, again, I don't necessarily prescribe to the way you frame the question. What I'm saying is they're still doing all of that. They're still answering the question that that they're trying to ask themselves. They're still trying to make it better, but their belief of making it better is going beyond the democratic remit of the House of Lords.
No, but it's exactly the same as it was in 2012. The democratic remit is identical. You can keep saying these words, but they don't change meaning the more you say them. So what's changed?
You can't push your revising chamber beyond the remit of frustrating the manifesto. There's a convention. And when they start doing that...
So what do you think was happening in 2003 when the Daily Mail wrote about how important it was to resist Tony Blair's attempts to change the House of Lords because his executive was too powerful? That is actually, I mean, to translate it into more manageable English, that is describing precisely what you've said has only started happening this year.
Well, to be fair, I mean, my respect for the Daily Mail is not very high. So.
That's not really the point, because we're trying to get inside the mindset of people who, like you, think that the House of Lords has somehow suddenly become something different from what it was in 2003 or 2012. But it hasn't, Aaron.
Well...
it hasn't.
You continue to contest that perspective, and...
I'm not contesting that perspective, I'm describing the facts.
I'm trying to describe to you why it's not, and for some reason...
Go on, have another go, then.
No, I don't think there's any point. I'll try. The whole point of the House of Lords is as a revising chamber. They bring us back things that we like and things that we don't. I accept that. That's not what I'm saying. But they do have limits to the edge of their remit, and one thing they cannot do is take us beyond the manifesto as per convention of the presiding government.
You are just going to say it again and again and again. So the House of Lords is utterly pointless because it's not allowed to challenge the presiding government.
It's not allowed to challenge, no.
Sorry, I'm not going to patronise you. I'm just going to take a break. And the nation's psychodrama continues. Would anybody care to explain to me how a vote for Brexit built upon a belief that parliamentary sovereignty had to be somehow returned to Westminster despite it never having left, and that control somehow had to be brought back to Westminster from the mythical Neolithic state of Brussels? How can that position now have turned into fury at the House of Lords, in the sovereign parliament, employing democracy to control the direction of the country? Anyone? Bueller? Anyone? John's in Putney. John, fill your boots.
Hi there. Right, well, I think there's a fundamental problem in Britain. It's one that's existed for a very long time. The British don't understand their own constitution. It's not a very easy one.
It would help if we wrote it down, wouldn't it? That would
It would really help. I was one of those people long ago who was involved in a constitutional reform group called
Charter 88. I did that at A-level, not meaning to make you feel old.
I know. Before that, my first foray to joining a party was because the Liberals, as they were then, this is pre-SDP,
yes,
actually proposed reforming the House of Lords, and they're the only party to dare do it in those days. And since then, I've graduated into another form of lobbying, and I've now dropped out of it. But the point is this: people do not understand the Constitution, and that goes for almost everybody. And then, as a result, politicians will run rings around them, either taking advantage of it, opposing it, pretending to understand it, or whatever, as we've seen with this latest mess. And it's the latest of a whole series of messes, and it doesn't surprise me at all. And unfortunately, the problem is this country has never undergone either defeat in war or revolution in the last 200 or 300 years.
Blimey, you've made a bit of a leap from Charter 88 to absence of armed revolution.
But it's that is probably the only way that you get a fundamental constitutional realignment and force people to sit down and construct something.
Do you think that if we had if we tested the public on the Constitution and only people who passed the test were allowed to vote in the Brexit referendum, what do you think the result would have been?
Well, I mean, I think the problem, it's not people's fault.
No, absolutely it's not people's fault.
System that has actually kept them in ignorance of it. And
yeah, aided and abetted by journalists. Very.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's a real problem.
Because if you don't understand stuff, I can get you to do what I want.
Exactly, and people misunderstand things. They're given to understand that something means slightly something else. And, of course, with an unwritten constitution that's nudged along by precedents, I mean, we've had the instance of, whether the right of Parliament to assent to going into war has become a constitutional precedent or not.
Yes.
Isn't really tested. We've only had a Supreme Court that can even judge on these things for, a handful of years. So as a result, we're in our absolute infancy in this area, and that's why it's such a problem.
I've heard you, and I enjoy your scholarship, but I'd like to do a little bit of amateur psychology now. How does your scholarship, how does that analysis play into the question of how somebody who would have sworn blind a month ago that the House of Lords was absolutely intrinsic to their sense of self, to their sense of nationhood, to their patriotic pride in Britain, the House of Lords, in the space of an eye blink, moved to the side calling for it to be abolished or reformed? What's happened?
It's simple political expediency, and the fact that they back themselves into an ideological corner which they can't really defend on any logical basis. So, that everything around them is falling apart. If you take the famous, the Brexit negotiations as a whole, I mean, they haven't got anywhere yet, basically. And
No, we're arguing over two customs union options that the European Union has already rejected.
Exactly.
Well, we're allowing people like Jacob Rees-Mogg to appear on the radio and the television without ever being asked to name one frictionless border on the entire planet that exists between two different customs areas, because there ain't one, but no one ever asks.
Exactly, and they're hoping to bluff this one out. This is where Britain's relationship with Europe has always been problematic. They work with treaties and logical constitutional processes. We just busk it all the way along. And
well, I disagree with that. Most of the treaties and constitutional processes have got British fingerprints all over them. Most obviously, the formation of the single market, which was pretty much the handiwork of Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, in fairness, and also there's the very famous remark about the German constitution. We were really generous. We were primary drivers in writing them a fantastic constitution after the Second World War.
I think we may have evidence of... I think I may have some grounds for some optimism for you. I've just seen the comments from the chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee about an imminent appearance from David Davis. Would you like to hear this?
Oh, go on, then.
I think things might be looking up, John. Seriously, you might want to sit down for this. The excitement could overcome you. Are we ready? This is David Davis, who's in charge of the Brexit negotiations, which at this point in time focus almost entirely upon the state of the Irish border. And this is the scrutinising committee within the House of Commons. So if you've been persuaded that the House of Lords are all wrong-uns, you've still got to be on the side of the select committees that scrutinise the Commons. This is the committee chair, Dr. Andrew Morrison, on the imminent arrival of David Davis to answer questions from the committee that exists solely to ask questions about Northern Irish issues. My committee is most disappointed that David Davis has turned down our invitation to give evidence on what all agree is an absolutely pivotal element of the Brexit process. Michel Barnier has given us oral evidence as EU negotiator, and the committee felt it would be reasonable to ask his UK counterpart, Mr. Davis, to do the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, frankly, if these people are being paid to do a job, then I think you could put pressure on them in the way that the American Constitution subpoenas people to appear. I think they could pretty much demand...
Drag him, kicking and screaming. And do you know what else I'd do? I'd pull the chewing gum from his mouth and insist that if he's talking to a select committee, he should treat them with the respect that the office commands. But, hey, all they have to do is disappoint the Daily Mail, and we'll be calling for the abolition of select committees by the weekend. John, I've got to crack on. There's lots of people waiting to talk. There is, however, room for a couple more if you want to grab the phone line that John is about to vacate. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Nick is in Cheltenham. Nick, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning. I think it could be a case of the Daily Mail and the other newspapers just wanting to blame somebody else and get a collection of people they can blame for delays and everything. Do you remember Gina Miller was absolutely really badly attacked for delaying things, for
using sovereign British law to enhance sovereign British parliamentary democracy? Yeah, the traitor.
They said she was delaying things, but that court case finished, I think, in December.
Yes.
And the government still didn't trigger Article 50 for another 3 months. So it's the government that delayed the triggering of that.
So it's a postponement of reality then, with the assembling of scapegoats.
Yes, because the government will want to blame Europe if the Northern Ireland situation isn't resolved.
I think they'll probably try to blame Lily Allen first.
Well, quite possibly. If they can collect a lot, the more people they can have as scapegoats, the more credible it will be they think, to blame Europe for...
Well, do you know, that's a very interesting suggestion, because what that means is that you believe, because I'm not sure I have such a high opinion of the sanity of some of the individuals involved, and I don't say that lightly. I don't mean mental illness. I mean a form of pathology, a kind of narcissistic, sociopathic tendency on the part of some of these people. But you're kinder than I am, or more optimistic than I am, because you think they've realised it's a disaster, and now they're trying desperately to avoid taking any responsibility for encouraging millions of newspaper readers to vote for this disaster.
Yeah, yes, they want to have that in reserve in any case.
I still think I don't know that they're that rational. I think that the narcissism that's kicked in now among some of these people is so immense that they can't even conceive intellectually of the scale of their error. So they don't even stop to think. They just keep shoveling, as opposed to covering their backs. They're just insisting that nobody stops to think. We keep pushing forward. Hate them, blame them. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder whether you're right and I'm wrong.
Well, the government is delaying things. It's blaming lots of other people for delaying things. But the Article 50 period was 2 years, and if it was all straightforward and easy, they would have triggered that 2-year process the day after the referendum.
And now, I don't know if you've noticed, but prominent Brexiters now are suggesting the transition period needs to be longer, so we're going to be in yet another surreal rabbit hole where the people who applauded Theresa May for triggering Article 50 when she did will be putting pressure on her to postpone the deadline that Article 50 unnecessarily imposed upon the negotiating process. And nobody in most of the media will point it out. Hang on a minute, you told her she was the new woman of steel when she triggered Article 50. You said that was a brilliant thing to do, and now you're saying that we shouldn't have done it so quickly, so can we please prolong the transition period?
Well, the transition period is supposed to end in December
March
2020.
Yes, the current transition period.
Which is 4.5 years after the referendum.
Yes.
And the minimum amount of time to leave the European Union is 2 years with the article. So it's
up to them. It's up to them as well. We have to ask them to extend the transition period. And I've seen some of the quasi-economists who were wheeled out because broadcasters have to have some semblance of balance. So you'd have lots of very, very qualified experts on one side of the table and then some right freak shows on the other. But the freak shows now are, I've noticed, coming out in favour of prolonging the transition period, despite being adamant that Theresa May did the right thing when she triggered it. I'm just going to examine your theory that they are assembling a long list of scapegoats because somewhere deep inside, even the most narcissistic of sociopaths have recognised that we are on a road to disaster. And I'm going to read the newspaper headline, and you tell me who it describes, Nick, all right?
I'll try.
Enemies of the people.
One of the scapegoats is that the House of Commons...
No, that's the next one. I'll give you a clue. That's the next one. Enemies of the people generally wear wigs.
Oh, judges.
Correct. Well done. Round of applause for Nick.
That was the Gina Miller one.
Yes, that's right. Next one, crush the saboteurs.
Was that Ken Clarke?
That's the MPs, actually democratically elected members of the Sovereign Parliament. Crush the saboteurs. Third one. This is quite easy, Nick. I'm not going to give you a prize for this one. Are Remainer universities.
Oh, that's academic.
And finally, it's time to pull plug on the Lords. So just to run through 4 Daily Mail front pages, you've got the independent judiciary, you've got the Sovereign Parliament as represented by MPs democratically elected to the House of Commons, you've got academic freedom and independence as recommended by some of the finest universities on the planet, and now you've got the House of Lords. So on reflection, your suggestion that there is a very deliberate and cynical attempt to assemble a veritable cornucopia of scapegoats looks better than my existential howl.
And they do know it's going wrong because they're having a delay of 4.5 years after the referendum rather than the required 2 years.
Yes, well, that's 4.5 years, but they are about to ask for more because somebody has finally explained to them what a just-in-time supply chain looks like. Because we were explaining it on this programme 2 years ago, but no one likes a clever clock. So on a vain search for people who are prepared to explain to me how they could have changed their mind completely about the House of Lords after the House of Lords had the audacity to do exactly what it is there for, i.e. revising legislation and preventing an executive from riding roughshod over Parliament. So I thought that you could perhaps have described John in Putney as being a little condescending when he said the British people don't understand the Constitution, but I'm afraid I'm not going to brook that criticism because he's absolutely right. The only earthly way in which you can go from liking the House of Lords to not liking the House of Lords after the House of Lords did exactly what it's there to do is if you're a massive hypocrite. And if you're completely ignorant of what the House of Lords was there to do. And you were completely ignorant of what the House of Lords was there to do when you thought that you were a massive fan of the House of Lords. So that now the House of Lords has done what it's there to do and you don't like what it's done, turns out you weren't a massive fan of the House of Lords after all. It's only about 10 years into this job that I developed the confidence to ask questions that I'm not expecting anybody to answer. But of course what that does from your point of view is it opens the possibility of me being inflicted upon you uninterrupted between one commercial break and the news headlines. And nobody really wants that. So give me another alternative. Give me another analysis of the facts. It's got to be a bit better than the lad in Liverpool's. You can't just say, I don't like the way you're framing the question. You have to answer it. Okay, and the question is, how can the House of Lords doing what the House of Lords is designed to do have changed your mind about supporting the House of Lords, which you previously did but now don't because it's done what it's designed to do. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Obviously, you can ring in to talk about the issues without necessarily answering that question, because otherwise I will be inflicted upon you uninterrupted between one commercial break and the news headlines. But I'd really like you to try. Is anyone actually prepared to ring in and say, yep, I'm with the Mail. I used to love the Lords because I'm patriotic, but now I hate it because, meh, fish. Anyone? Tim's in Colchester. Tim, I don't know whether you've risen to the challenge or whether you're coming at it from a slightly more measured perspective. Let's find out.
I'm probably going to disappoint you, I'm afraid, James.
Never mind, Tim.
Just
Story of my life.
Yeah, just on a side issue before that, I wanted to say that I really like the way that you reach for analogies from Animal Farm.
Occasionally.
Yeah, well, everybody, when they talk about Orwellian things, they always reach for 1984.
Yes.
I remember reading Animal Farm when I was at school, and it was one of the two books that had a really profound political impact on me, and I think it's a massively underrated work.
I'm with you completely. What was the other one?
A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich.
Oh, blimey. You went to a good school, or at least you had a good English teacher.
Well, I had a good English teacher, a good history teacher. I nearly rang in yesterday to talk about my history teacher, but didn't quite get there. And some of the examples you had were much more inspiring anyway. So,
well, you're here now. So, yes. You're here now. Talk about the Lords.
Yeah, I'm coming to it from a slightly different angle in that I believed for a long time that the Lord needs reform, but I think that it needs more powers rather than less.
Oh.
I'd like to see a second chamber that has more of a legislative heft to it, if you like, a little bit like the US Senate. But I have to admit, I'm not 100% sure on how you would do that. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd appoint something like 100 Martin Lewises.
Yes.
And you think that would be utopian second chamber, but of course that's never going to exist. I've also thought sometimes that the idea of looking at people for a second chamber like jury service might be an interesting way of doing things, but then you ask the question, well, how do you pick the right people? And of course, if it's jury service, it's done at random. So
oddly, I think the 2012 proposal looked at fixed terms, didn't it, for even for appointees? So that would assuage some of your. I think, if I've understood you, that would assuage some of your reservations.
Yes. You just like the second chamber to be quite independent.
And for me, I'd like it to be full of experts.
Yes.
That's why you mentioned Martin Lewis. But I mean, there are very few people that most of us would agree is an expert. Post-Brexit, the very word expert has been debased and degraded, which kind of explains why so much mad stuff is unfolding at the moment. Who would you...
That's one of the things that annoys me the most, this denigration of expertise, of knowledge, of learning, of understanding. I mean,
our Remainer universities, remember? They're down with academic freedom, academic independence and thinking.
Well, it's the whole psyche. I mean, one of the periods of history that I look on with quite a lot of fondness is the Restoration period, sort of post-1660. And that was a great period of enlightenment. And I almost think that we've gone backwards in the last couple of years, that we don't value enlightenment and learning and empirical science and all those areas of knowledge.
Someone should write a book about these themes. I'm not going to call it the age of unenlightenment, although that was definitely a contender. I thought it was a bit confusing. So, is there? And I genuinely hope there is, even though we have, I suppose, fun is an accurate word, detailing the scale of the deceit and the damage. But is there a more charitable analysis of somebody who has, in the space of the last 6 seconds, as a result of events in the House of Lords this week, completely changed their lifetime's opinion of the House of Lords? Is there an analysis of it that doesn't just say, well, you never really understood what the House of Lords was for and you're a blithering idiot?
I think John M. Putney's analysis was very good, that a lot of people don't understand what the Constitution is all about, and it would be hugely helpful if it was written down.
So what did they like about the House of Lords before? Was it just forelock tugging? Did they just think, don't be ridiculous, how dare you suggest that we reform the House of Lords? It's full of lords, doff cap, tug, forelock, vote, Rees-Mogg.
because it coincided with their point of view. And they're the sort of people, and the Daily Mail is all about this, that whenever something coincides with their point of view, then, yeah, they're all for it. It's fine. They love judges if they're handing down stiff sentences to poor people who can't afford to buy a loaf of bread or something like that. But it's that sort of that authoritarian.
I mean, to move it away from the cheerleaders and look instead at the cheering crowds, and this is where it is hard not to sound, what did the Sun call me? Like a sneering, smug, sanctimonious, condescending, obsessively politically correct champagne socialist public schoolboy Ramona. That's what happens when you think and point stuff out.
Put that on your CV.
It's on my Twitter profile. I may put it. I may put it on the flyleaf, but the problem then becomes that you have this kind of inability to understand other people. I understand crazy newspaper people desperately flogging papers off the back of the public's ignorance. Kelvin Mackenzie put it best back in the day when he described in very, very, very unflattering terms his perception of what a Sun reader was. History's probably judged him to be right with that incredibly low opinion of the people who paid his own wages. But it's not a place I'm comfortable. I don't want to have such a low opinion of my fellow public. So I do want to have a more intelligent analysis of how anyone could change their mind about the House of Lords as a result of the House of Lords doing what it's always been there to do. And I don't think there is one. I think Aaron tried from Liverpool by telling us that the House of Lords isn't like what it used to be, despite it not having changed at all in the intervening 6 years. That's not going to float any boats, but it's an indication perhaps of the psychological process that's desperately trying to resist the conclusion that you have literally no convictions. When you supported it, it was for things you don't really understand, and now you've changed your mind about it because of things you don't really understand. It's bleak, and it's a little bit smug, a little condescending, but possibly it's also the truth.
Yeah, one of the things that I think you have to remember as well is that print media, people like the Mail and the Sun and that sort of thing, are possibly a dying breed, because a lot of people are getting their news from various...
They're determined to take the rest of the country with them, Tim. That's the problem.
But I think that's important to understand why they behave the way that they do. Because they are under threat, then they double down on what they already know. So the Daily Mail will get even more Daily Mail, and the Sun will get even more Sun in order to hold on to the constituency that they have. And that constituency, without wishing to be condescending or anything like that, is probably an older, less educated, less enlightened constituency, and so the sort of the rabid hypocrisy becomes even sharper and even more focused.
Yes, except they won't acknowledge that it's hypocrisy, and that's what I find so dispiriting in the context of my fellow citizens of this country, when you can see one of the loudest propagandists in the land undertaking a full U-turn, not just a sort of slightly nuanced change of direction. We're shifting from north to northeast. They have gone from slavish devotion to the House of Lords to absolutely unequivocal calls for it to be unplugged, for it to be reformed or abolished, and yet they never have the decency, the grace, I would say the good old-fashioned sense of British fair play to turn around and say that that's what they're doing. And why can't they say that that's what they're doing? Because then they'd have to explain why. And if they had to explain why, they'd have to say, I'm really sorry. These really, really strong opinions we've been punting for 20 years. It turns out we didn't understand anything that we were talking about. 11:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next to recent events in the Middle East. I interviewed Ronan Farrow yesterday, the journalist who broke the Harvey Weinstein story in America at the beginning of last year and who remains at the very, very forefront of American media. It's a fascinating bloke. Do you know he went to university when he was 11? I couldn't quite believe my eyes. I had to double-check my notes. 11 years old, graduated at 15. Was a foreign policy advisor, working with Richard Holbrooke in the Barack Obama's government, the special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he's only 30 now. He's one of those people that just makes you feel utterly, utterly inadequate. But I asked him what Donald Trump's motivation for dismantling, violating the Iranian nuclear agreement was, expecting him to say stuff I didn't really understand. But he didn't. He just said there is no real analysis of this. It is, as far as almost everybody in DC believes, simply a desire to burn down and tear up anything that Barack Obama did, whether it was good or bad or indifferent. That's quite a bleak analysis, I felt. 11:51 is the time. Nazanin Ansari is an Iranian-British journalist, the managing editor of Kayhan London, and she joins me on the line now, hopefully to provide a more nuanced analysis. What will the... We've seen the reaction of the hardliners in Tehran, Nazanin, the, you know, predictable burnings of American flags, and it's hard not to conclude that Donald Trump's done exactly what the most dangerous elements of the Iranian establishment would have wanted him to do.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me on the show. There is this other point of view as well, that if he hadn't done that, they would actually, it would embolden them to say, we stood firm, and Donald Trump stood, kept the deal going. But let me add a caveat. I personally was hoping that he would keep the deal, because the Islamic Republic and Iran, they were abiding by that deal. Mind you, it was all brought up because the entire what culminated into JCPOA started under George W. Bush, and the intention was to change the behavior of the regime in Iran. And nuclear was one aspect of it. Terrorism, support for groups that support violence in the Middle East, and human rights were the other two. With JCPOA, they took one aspect of this behavior off, but the other two simply worsened. And so here we are today, but at the end of the day, for the people of Iran, they jubilated the signing of the deal, simply because they want their country to be integrated into the international community.
Does the leadership, does the government want that? Does Rouhani want that?
Rouhani needs it. Rouhani and the leadership need to be need Iran's economy to flourish, to become better. They want. They are in the state of the economy is near bankruptcy. We've got a banking crisis. I mean, there were reports last week, for example, like 1 in 10 Iranians are suffering some form of mental anguish.
Gosh.
And this is because of the social malaise that is ruling the country as a whole. And Iranians jubilated the signing of JCPOA, but at the end of the day, the prospects for JCPOA rested on inside Iran as well, simply because the Revolutionary Guards would not give up on their missile program. They were expanding it. The human rights situation has been worsened since the signing of JCPOA. And it is, we are dealing with the regime that unfortunately is very chauvinistic. Women enjoy only half of the rights of men, according to the constitution and the legal framework in Iran. And they think that they can win.
I see. So to move into the 21st century, or at least the back end of the 20th century, would be the direction of travel for the government and for most moderate citizens of Iran. Briefly, Nazanin, if you would, the exchange of missiles that we've seen overnight, the Israeli military said 20 rockets were fired at its positions on the Golan Heights overnight, and they've launched attacks in response upon Iranian positions in Syria. Was that entirely predictable? Did you greet that news with utter resignation, or are you surprised by the escalation?
Well, in the past month, we've had one Israeli attack against positions of the Revolutionary Guards and installations, their installations in Syria, one attack every 5 days. And certainly, I think the IRGC wanted to have a show of force. Perhaps Donald Trump withdrawing from the deal gave them a green light. Until then, the government was holding them back. But now we've started, and hopefully it will end here. I doubt it.
What's the worst case scenario then, if that's the best case scenario?
For Iran?
Yes. Not for the world, actually.
for the world, of course, I would always like to look at the best case scenario, and that's like a driver. When you sit in a car, you have to have a destination where to go to. The best case scenario would be a regime change in Iran. The worst case scenario would be to have an attack on the soil of Iran, for Iran to be attacked directly.
Thank you very much indeed. Not exactly upbeat, but I suspect accurate. Nazanin Ansari, I hope we'll speak again. 11:56 is the time. Back to the House of Lords and this curious conversion, if you will, of people who spent their entire lives loving it, this week deciding that they've actually secretly hated it all along. Can we get inside that psychological process? Can we understand that flip-flop? Paul is in Bardley. Paul, what can you tell us?
I'd like to point out the hypocrisy that exists in the House of Lords. There are a number of Lords who are in receipt of an EU pension. To receive that pension, they have to have had sworn an oath of allegiance and loyalty to the EU and the Commission and its associated bodies.
Do UKIP MEPs have to do that as well?
Yes, they do.
So they've all sworn an oath of allegiance to the EU bodies?
There are no...
While campaigning to leave it?
There are no... Let me... Please, can I finish a point?
I'm trying to clarify what you've already said. That's all.
You are discussing the House of Lords. There are no UKIP members in the House of Lords.
Well, there are, mate.
Let me go back to my point.
Well, hang on. You can't say things that aren't true.
Anybody receiving an EU pension,
which is all UKIP MEPs,
is a clear conflict of interest, and they should have absolutely no influence on the democratic process of this country.
To clarify, all UKIP MEPs. No, Paul. Again, if you just keep speaking, it doesn't become more true by repetition. So, first of all, there are UKIP representatives in the House of Lords. That's a matter of fact and record. Second of all, every UKIP MEP will be expecting to get an EU pension, so the idea that they've sworn an oath of allegiance to the EU and its institutions is certainly interesting. And third of all, what makes you think that they're not going to keep their pensions after we've left the European Union? Because they've all said that they are.
I don't think that will, but is there or is there not a clear conflict of interest from people who sit in one body, which is part of the...
I've answered your question to save you some breath.
While simultaneously being financially rewarded from the other party.
Okay, I'll ask you again. I'll ask you...
interest.
Yes, okay, again, just repeating it doesn't make it less silly.
It's a very straightforward...
And I've answered it. I said no, there's no conflict of interest unless they're going to lose their money after we leave the European Union, which they're not.
There is a clear conflict of interest.
There isn't.
Yes, there is.
There isn't.
Right, OK. Can I just remind you of two facts, Mr. O'Brien?
Please, yes. As long as they are facts, because so far we haven't had any.
Right. Fact number one.
Yes.
The MPs voted by a ratio of 5-1 to give the people the decision whether to leave the European Union or remain in it to the people in a referendum. Fact number one.
Yes.
Fact number two, the pamphlet that was sent to each and every household at the cost of £9 million to the taxpayer, stated that the government will enact your decision. Not the House of Lords, nobody else, not Parliament, the government. And that was as close as a contract between the government and the people as you can get.
And we have a parliamentary democracy which the government has to operate under in order to achieve anything, which everybody knows. So we'll go back. Those are facts, I think, but let's go back to the original claim. First of all, that there's no UKIP members in the House of Lords. Can we just agree that that's not true?
Yes.
So that was wrong. And second of all, can we agree?
Unlike yourself,
oh, Paul, mate, come on, Paul. Do they keep their pensions?
To be frank, I couldn't care less whether they do or
because you have to answer that question before you can decide whether or not there's a conflict of interest, Paul.
Ask me the question again.
Do they keep their pensions?
I do not know the answer.
Well, I have told you, my friend, and I perhaps should have told you before you started talking, and you could have saved yourself a lot of embarrassment. It's 12 noon.